There are stories I come back to, dear friends, when the fire burns low and the night gets long. Stories about the distance between a person's worth and the world's willingness to see it. Pull your chair a little closer. This is one of those stories. The letter arrived at Lord Caius Holt's office on a Tuesday in October, and he read exactly one paragraph of it before folding it closed and setting it beside his morning report. He was the Earl of Whitmore, 40 years old, recently appointed to chair the Royal Committee on Public Health, and very much accustomed to receiving correspondence from people who believed they understood medicine better than the men who had spent decades practicing it, farmers warning about bad air, clergymen recommending prayer as prophylaxis, landowners citing superstition dressed in the language of science. This letter, however, arrived from someone named Miss Phoebe Craddock of Dunfield, a small mill town 60 miles north of London, well outside the committee's current area of focus. The letter concerned the fever. Dunfield had been losing people since August. Intestinal fever, what the committee was tracking across 12 mill districts in the north of England. Lord Holt's official report attributed it to overcrowding and inadequate removal of organic waste. Standard causes, well-documented causes, causes that explained the pattern in 11 of the 12 districts rather tidily. Miss Craddock believed Lord Holt was wrong about Dunfield specifically. She wrote with unusual precision. The fever, she argued, was not spreading between people in the way one expected from a contagious agent. The workers at Maddox Textile, 12 hours a day in close quarters, were not the ones dying in the highest numbers. It was the families on Carrow Lane and the lower end of Millfield Road. People who drew their water from well number 3, behind the churchyard. She included a table, a hand-drawn table, columns organized by street, by water source, by date of onset, by outcome, 47 cases mapped across 3 months. Lord Holt got as far as the table's heading before he registered the name at the bottom of the letter. Miss Phoebe Craddock, niece of Mr. Bernard Craddock, village apothecary, Dunfield. He folded the letter. From the north, asked Mr. Alec Holt, his younger cousin, who served as his administrative secretary and who had perfected the art of reading the room. A woman from a mill town believes she has identified the source of the Dunfield outbreak. Alec looked interested. Lord Holt's expression discouraged this. She recommends we investigate a particular well, Lord Holt said, on the basis of a table she has drawn herself. Is the table credible? It is neat. He handed the letter to Alec. Write a reply. Thank Miss Craddock for her attention to community welfare. Remind her that the committee has engaged qualified physicians to conduct field assessments and that Dr. Wexford's report is expected within the fortnight. Alec looked at the table for a moment longer than Lord Holt considered necessary. Dr. Wexford's report focuses on the textile district, Alec said carefully. As it should. That is where the density is highest. Miss Craddock's table suggests that textile workers are not the primary victims. Miss Craddock's table suggests many things. Lord Holt reached for his official correspondence. Send the reply. Now, dear friends, I want you to sit with something for a moment. Lord Holt was not a cruel man. He was not, by the standards of his time and station, even an unreasonable one. He had built his reputation on evidence and method. He believed in documentation. He believed in training. He simply also believed, the way powerful men in any era tend to believe, that evidence and method lived in particular rooms, and that a letter from an apothecary's niece was not one of those rooms. The reply reached Dunfield 4 days later. Phoebe Craddock read it at the writing desk in the back of her uncle's shop, between a jar of dried willow bark and a stack of medical periodicals that had no business being in an apothecary's back room, but had lived there since her father sent her the first subscription when she was 19. She was 28 years old. She had the kind of face that was easy to underestimate. Quiet features, steady dark eyes, the sort of composure that people sometimes mistook for diffidence, until she opened her mouth and said something that rewrote the terms of the conversation. Bernard Craddock watched her read from across the counter. He had raised her after her parents died in a river crossing accident when she was 16, and he had learned over those 12 years that when Phoebe's expression went very still, she was not accepting something. She was deciding what to do next. He declined to investigate, Bernard asked. His secretary declined, Phoebe said, politely. They are waiting for Dr. Wexford's report. Then perhaps Dr. Wexford will look at the well. Dr. Wexford has not spoken to a single family on Carrow Lane, I checked. She turned back to her desk. Mrs. Hollis on Carrow Lane lost her husband last week. Her children are showing symptoms. They draw from well number 3. Bernard adjusted his spectacles. What will you do? Write again. She did. The second letter was shorter. Where the first had explained her reasoning in full, this one asked a single question. Had anyone tested the water in well no. 3 for the presence of heavy mineral contamination? She noted that the Maddox Dye Works, which had expanded operations upstream in June, used arsenic compounds in their indigo fixing process. She noted that arsenic poisoning in its chronic form could produce gastrointestinal symptoms nearly indistinguishable from intestinal fever. She noted that this would explain why the textile workers, who drew from well number 1, the company well, were not the primary victims. She included the name and address of a chemist in Leeds who could perform a water analysis within 2 weeks. Lord Holt received this letter during a committee meeting. He read it in full this time. Then he read it again. He carried it home and set it beside the official map of Dunfield's sanitation infrastructure. He found well number 3. He found the Maddox Dye Works, marked 2 streets north. He sat with this longer than he intended. Arsenic. Not contagion. Environmental contamination from an industrial source. If she was correct, and the geographical pattern she described did fit the contamination model more cleanly than it fit the transmission model, then Dr. Wexford's entire report was focused in the wrong direction. He wrote to the chemist in Leeds himself. He did not mention Miss Craddock's name. He simply requested an expedited analysis of water drawn from well number 3 in Dunfield, citing committee authority. Then he asked Alec to find out everything known about the author of the letter. The reply from Dunfield was brief. Miss Phoebe Craddock, 28, unmarried, resident of Dunfield since 16. Father had been a physician in Edinburgh, formerly trained, notably skilled, dead 12 years. She assisted her uncle in his apothecary, kept accounts, managed dispensing, and by several local reports had, for years, quietly advised the families of Dunfield on medical matters that their distance from a qualified doctor made otherwise inaccessible. No scandal, no professional standing, no credentials recognized by any institution. Lord Holt read this. Then he pulled 3 issues of the Northern Medical Review from his bookcase. He had been a subscriber for years. It was a smaller journal than the London publications, but it published serious work, and it had, over the past 4 years, featured a recurring series of papers by someone writing under the initials PC, articles on the environmental causes of intestinal disease in industrial districts. Articles that Lord Holt had on 2 occasions publicly disagreed with in print, arguing that the author underweighted person-to-person transmission in favor of environmental factors. PC had replied to both disagreements with calm, precise, and, he could admit it now, persuasive counter-arguments. He looked at the letters on his desk. Then he looked at the journal. Miss Phoebe Craddock, PC. He looked at this for a very long time. Then he ordered his carriage north. Before I go on, dear friends, if this kind of story speaks to you, I hope you'll consider joining us here at Moonlight at Marlowe. We tell stories like this one often. Stories about minds that were forced to prove what others were simply trusted to possess. Stories that remind you the evidence was never the problem. It was the room that wouldn't open. Subscribe if you haven't. The next one is already waiting. He arrived in Dunfield on a Thursday, unannounced. He found Miss Craddock not at the apothecary, but at the edge of the churchyard, crouched beside the stone lip of well number 3, with a glass collection vial and a notebook braced against her knee. A boy of about 12 stood nearby holding a lantern despite the full daylight. Lord Holt descended from his carriage. Miss Craddock. She looked up without standing. Her expression registered recognition, and then, immediately, something that looked more like concern than deference. "You weren't expected," she said. "I came without announcing myself. That is ill-advised when there is a possible contamination site involved." She finished sealing the vial and stood, brushing chalk dust from her skirt. "How close have you been to this well?" Lord Holt realized he had been about to step forward and had instead been evaluated for exposure risk by a woman he outranked by several categories of social standing. "I have not drawn from it." "Good." She handed the lantern boy the vial and a slip of paper. "Tommy, to Mr. Fitch, please. Tell him same as last week." She turned back to Lord Holt. "I've been taking samples every Thursday for 6 weeks. We'll know by Monday whether this week's reading matches the pattern." "The chemist in Leeds has received the sample I requested," Lord Holt said. Something shifted in her face. "You ordered the analysis." "I am here, Miss Craddock, because your second letter gave me reason to." "Not the first." There was no sharpness in the question, only precision. "Not the first," he admitted. "May I see your data?" She led him to the apothecary and up a narrow staircase to a room that stopped him in the doorway. Every surface contained something: handwritten ledgers, hand-drawn maps of Dunfield's water infrastructure, stacked medical journals with marked pages, a large board on the far wall covered in colored pins and string, case locations, water source assignments, dates of onset, dates of death. The board was not an approximation. It was a system. "This is 6 weeks of work," he asked. 6 weeks of recording. 2 years of building the methodology. She moved to the board and pointed to the cluster of pins in the lower district. Every confirmed case is connected to well number 3 or to household contact with someone who draws from it. Every case in the textile district is explainable by secondary exposure: a wife who carries water home, a child who visits a family on Carrow Lane. Lord Holt examined the board. She had done something he had rarely seen done even by trained epidemiologists. She had drawn the negative space. She had mapped the people who should have been sick by transmission logic and were not, and then explained why. "You published on environmental causation 2 years ago," he said, "in the Northern Medical Review, under PC." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes. I argued against your methodology in print." "I know." "You responded." "Yes. You knew who I was when you wrote the first letter. Your name was on the article." She looked at him steadily. "You did not know who I was when you dismissed it." He could not deny it. He had read PC's work in journals and imagined without much conscious thought a senior researcher, a physician with a university appointment, a man with a private library and decades of institutional backing. He had argued with that imagined figure, argued genuinely, respected the mind behind the initials, and then received a letter from a woman in a mill town and read exactly 1 paragraph. "I published under my initials so the work might be read before the reader decided whether the person behind it deserved attention," Phoebe said. Her voice was level, not bitter, simply factual in the way that facts about long-standing justice sometimes become when a person has had years to make peace with carrying them. I had hoped the same consideration might apply to my correspondence. The Leeds chemist's report arrived the following Monday. Well number 3 contained arsenic at 3 times the concentration of the other village sources. The contamination pathway traced directly to the Maddox Dye Works drainage channel, which ran beneath Carrow Lane in a culvert that had been inadequately sealed when the works expanded in June. Lord Holt read the report alone, then he reread both of Phoebe's letters, then he pulled the last exchange he and PC had conducted in print, in which he had stated, quite firmly, that environmental mineral contamination was an insufficient explanation for the distribution patterns observed in northern mill fever cases. He had been wrong. She had been right. She had been right in print, in letters, and in a room full of coloured pins above an apothecary, and he had needed a laboratory analysis to accept what her tables had already shown him. He wrote the reply himself this time. Miss Craddock, the analysis confirms your hypothesis. Well, Number 3 will be closed by committee order. I intend to request a full review of industrial drainage compliance across Dunfield. I would ask that you attend the committee's preliminary session in London next Thursday as a consulting analyst. Your name will appear on the record. C. Holt. Now, dear friends, you might think this was the end of the difficulty. That once a powerful man admitted he was wrong, the machinery would simply correct itself and roll forward in a better direction. You know as well as I do that it is rarely that simple. Dr. Stanton Wexford arrived at the committee session with his own report. He was 53, widely celebrated, the sort of man who received honorary degrees at dinners and accepted them with the modest pleasure of someone who considered them mildly overdue. He had been in the field, he said, and had independently reached certain conclusions about the Dunfield situation. His conclusions were detailed in 12 pages. They described the contamination pathway from an upstream industrial source. They cited, without attribution, a methodology of case clustering by water source. They referenced a table of 47 recorded cases. Phoebe sat at the end of the committee table and read Dr. Wexford's report without visible reaction. Lord Holt read it standing, at his place at the head of the table, while Dr. Wexford explained his findings to the assembled committee. The table was hers. The methodology was hers. The case cluster map on page 4 was a redrawn version of her board. The conclusions were accurate because they had been derived from her work, without her name attached anywhere in the document. Dr. Wexford, Lord Holt said. The doctor looked up, satisfied and brisk. When did you conduct your field assessment in Dunfield? A pause, brief enough that most people would not catch it. I was there in the 2nd week of October. And these 47 cases, did you conduct the patient interviews yourself? I compiled available records. Whose records? Another pause, local records, the apothecary's files. Mr. Bernard Craddock's files. Lord Holt set the report down. Dr. Wexford, Miss Craddock is seated at this table. She collected these patient records. She constructed this methodology. She drew this table, and she communicated it to this committee 6 weeks ago, in a letter I declined to act on immediately. He said this plainly without softening it. I would like you to explain how her work arrived in your report under no attribution. The room became very still. Dr. Wexford looked at Phoebe with the expression of a man recalibrating his assumptions rapidly. The records were made available to me by her uncle, he said. In good faith, I assumed them to be general practice records. The methodology was not a general practice record, Phoebe said. Her voice was quiet and even. It was a designed system of case analysis. If you read it as a general record, that is a reading that requires explanation. I was not informed of any claimed authorship. The table carries my notation system, she said. The same notation appears in my published work, in the Northern Medical Review. Under the initials PC, she looked toward Lord Holt. I believe Lord Holt is familiar with that notation. He was. Dr. Wexford placed both hands flat on the table. This is an extraordinary accusation to make in a committee setting. It is an ordinary request for accurate attribution, Phoebe said. The accusation is contained in your report. What happened next was not immediate vindication. I will not pretend it was that clean, dear friends. Dr. Wexford was a celebrated man in a room full of people who had spent careers deferring to him. 2 committee members suggested the overlap was likely coincidental. One suggested that Miss Craddock had perhaps not fully understood the significance of her own records, and that Dr. Wexford had brought them to their proper analytical conclusion. That was when Lord Holt said something I have thought about many times since. He said, "I have been corresponding with PC of the Northern Medical Review for 4 years. I have argued against 2 of those papers in print, at length and in public. I know that methodology, I know its structure, its notation, its habits of reasoning. This report did not arrive at this table independently. It was built on work this committee almost dismissed because the person who wrote it did not carry a title we recognized." He paused. "If we protect this error, we protect the system that produced it, and the next Phoebe Craddock will not send the second letter." The review that followed took 3 weeks. Her original letters were produced with their postmark dates. Her notebooks provided a time-stamped record of methodology development going back 22 months. Her published papers under PC established the analytic lineage clearly. The patient interview records in her handwriting predated Dr. Wexford's field visit by 11 weeks. Dr. Wexford issued a formal correction. He called it an administrative error. He did not apologize. His reputation survived, though it carried a new weight with it from that point forward. The kind of weight that attaches to a man when people know precisely what he was willing to do when no one was expected to check. Phoebe's name was entered into the committee record as primary analyst for the Dunfield case. The Northern Medical Review's editor, who had always suspected but never confirmed that PC was a woman, published her full name for the first time, alongside a formal retrospective of her 4 previous articles. Miss Phoebe Craddock, environmental epidemiologist. She saw the issue in the window of a Leeds bookshop while passing through on committee business. She went inside and stood there, looking at it for a long moment. Lord Holt found her there. He had, for reasons he told himself were entirely professional, developed a habit of knowing her approximate schedule when committee work brought them to the same city. "You didn't buy it," he said. It felt strange. To purchase something with my own name printed in it. That is the least rational thing you have ever said to me. Don't become accustomed to it. They stood at the window together, and for a moment, the street noise and the shop smells and all the reasonable professional distance between them seemed to become aware of itself and step back. "The committee has approved a new field position," Lord Holt said. "Environmental causation in industrial districts. Formal salary, full attribution, permanent record. You created it. I recommended it. The committee approved it on its merits." He paused, "as you would want." She looked at him then, and he understood, had understood for some time now, that he had been doing with Phoebe Craddock what he had done with PC, in print all those years, meeting a mind so precisely calibrated to the same frequency as his own that the only honest response was to keep finding reasons to argue with it, because that was the only way to stay in the room. "If I accept," she said, "I will disagree with you frequently." "You already do. Formally, on the record, in committee reports. I expect that. And you will not cite my position as the reason to discount my findings." "No," he met her eyes, "I will cite your findings as the reason your position was created." She was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came in flat through the bookshop window and lay across the open journal page where her name was printed, finally in full. "Then I accept." It took another season before anything bolted beyond professional respect was acknowledged between them, and I will tell you only that when it was acknowledged, it was done without ceremony and in the middle of a disagreement about groundwater table mapping, which Phoebe later said was the most appropriate setting possible, and which Lord Holt did not dispute. Well, No. 3 was sealed within a week of the committee's order. The Maddox Dye Works was fined and required to reroute its drainage through a properly lined filtration channel. The fever cases on Carrow Lane did not develop further. The families who had drawn from that well for 3 years were given alternative access, and monitored through the winter. Mrs. Hollis, who had lost her husband in September, and whose children had been showing early symptoms at the time of Phoebe's second letter, wrote to the committee in January. Her children had recovered fully. She thanked the medical authorities generally, and could not have known, that the woman who had mapped her family's suffering onto a hand-drawn table, and then written a second letter when the first was ignored, was now sitting in a London office with her name on the door. Bernard Cragg found that letter from Mrs. Hollis later, tucked inside the front cover of Phoebe's case notebook. The one she had carried to well number 3 every Thursday for 6 weeks, in all weather, recording numbers that no one had yet agreed to read. He did not mention finding it. He understood what it meant to her. He had understood her better than most people ever had, and he knew that some things are kept not because they are secret, but because they are true in a way that doesn't require an audience. That notebook became in time the methodological foundation for the committee's standard guidelines on environmental case analysis, adopted and published in the spring of 1861, referenced in every major public health report for the following 3 decades. It cited her name. Dear friends, I have been telling stories long enough to know that the ones that stay with us are not always the ones where the right person won in the end. They are the ones where winning required a very specific kind of courage, the courage to send the second letter, to keep recording the numbers on cold Thursday mornings, to go back to the well because the evidence required it, even when no one had yet agreed to look. Lord Holt said once, in a lecture I am told was standing room only, that the greatest cost of institutional blindness is not the error it commits. It is the second letter it never receives, from the person who decided after the first reply that silence was the only remaining option. Phoebe Craddock sent the second letter. She had been right too. If this story found you tonight, dear friends, I hope you'll stay a while longer. There are more evenings here at Moonlight at Marlowe, more fires, more stories about the long and specific work of being seen clearly by a world that has decided in advance what it is willing to see. Subscribe if you haven't already, and come back soon. I'll be here, and the next story is worth your time.